The Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today we are joined by political scientist Paul Buchanan, and in this episode we will discuss the ongoing Russian attacks against Ukraine, and the topics will include whether the Russian Federation's President Vladimir Putin has lost the support of significant leaders that he was to rely on, and if so, what does this mean for Russia as a global power? Also, we will discuss the enduring impact of oligarch wealth being frozen in Switzerland and the SWIFT international banking system blocking funds transfer to and fro from Russia. And finally, we will examine the status of the European Union and NATO as a military force opposing Putin's Russia, and whether Russian generals, and what scenario could lead to this, could eventually confront Putin's power. But before we dig into these huge issues, remember, if you are joining us live via the social media platforms, feel free to comment as we can include your interaction and your questions in this program. So let's cross to Paul, who is waiting online right now to discuss these issues. Good afternoon, tēnā koe, Paul.
Kia ora, Selwyn. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. Obviously, it's a raft of big issues that we'll skip through today. And this is basically a snapshot of what is happening on all of those topics right at this moment. Next week, our intention is to go deep and do a deep dive, I should say, into some aspects of this from a strategic and it also, examine the tactical elements of it. Before we get into this, Paul, let's just see what has happened in the last few hours, and just cross here to what Reuters put out about an hour and a half ago.
Completely destroyed.
Russia stepped up its lethal bombardment of major Ukrainian cities on Wednesday, which its invasion force has so far failed to capture. The eastern city of Kharkiv has experienced the most intensive shelling across the country. Its centre, a bombed-out wasteland of ruined buildings and debris. Russian forces fired a cruise missile into the city council building, according to the region's deputy governor, and footage shows a police department engulfed in flames following a Russian strike. This man said he saw multiple bodies on the ground after a residential building was bombed. Also on Wednesday, Moscow claimed it had captured its first sizable city, Kherson. But Ukraine disputes this and says they are fighting on in the provincial capital. Ukraine's capital city, Kyiv, a city of 3 million people, has held out in the face of increasingly heavy shelling, though Western governments say a huge armoured column stretched for miles along the road to Kyiv has been largely frozen in place for days. On Tuesday, Russia blasted the main television tower near a Holocaust memorial, killing bystanders and causing heavy damage to several shops. With Moscow having failed in its aim of swiftly overthrowing Ukraine's government after nearly a week, Western countries are worried that it's switching to new, far more violent tactics to blast its way into cities it had expected to easily take. Russia said it had sent delegates for a second round of peace talks in Belarus near the border. But speaking to Reuters, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia needed to stop bombing if it wanted to negotiate peace.
We are for dialogue, yes, but the least that must happen is the bombardment of people must stop. You simply have to stop the bombardment and then sit down behind the table for talks.
Putin ordered what he calls a special military operation last Thursday in a bid to disarm Ukraine and capture what Russia regards as dangerous nationalists. Ukraine seeks closer ties with the West, which Russia calls a threat.
So, Paul, that's pretty much the run of play as it's occurring right now. And as we can see from that video footage and also the dialogue there, that there has been significant infrastructure destruction that has occurred at the hands of the Russian military there. It does seem that interesting, if we speak to that point and speak to the strength or otherwise of Russia's advance into Ukraine, that column that we see, the American strategists seem to be analysing that as an opportunity for Ukrainian defence as opposed to anything else, and seem to suggest that is not a convoy, that is a traffic jam. What I kind of was thinking back to, for example, when Saddam Hussein was withdrawing out of Kuwait, and there was that convoy, the highway of death, if it ended up, where the American forces or American-led forces used the hogs to basically destroy all of that military hardware along that convoy. What do you think is going on? Does this indicate that Ukraine does not have control of its airspace, so therefore it is not advancing on this, or is it primarily one of wanting to bog and slow them down, and that perhaps more striking guerrilla type attacks on those convoys is what's halted it there, or is it logistics? A lot of questions there, Paul.
Yeah. Okay, let's there's a lot to unpack there. Let's start out by pointing out that this idea that they bogged down and they haven't been able to achieve their objectives rapidly in 7 days belies the fact that, for example, it took the United States 3 weeks to reach Baghdad and gain control of Baghdad against a much inferior military. So 7 days is not necessarily slow. Now, they have encountered unexpected resistance, and I guess we should just reaffirm what we've said in the past. The objective remains the same. Take the eastern side of the country, overthrow the government in Kiev, install a puppet regime, and Finlandize all of Eastern Europe while fracturing the NATO alliance. If this continues, the reverse is going to occur. And we'll get back to, how NATO has reunified around the threat of the Russian bear. But with regards to the tactics right now, this is the quandary, especially with an increasingly isolated authoritarian leader like Putin. If he doesn't make good on his promises, and so if this stretches out for another week or two, then the knives may start will be coming out in the Kremlin, and he's got a choice. He either can back off and admit defeat, and again, a tie in this instance goes to the Ukraine. So if it's a stalemate, the Ukrainians win. But if he does that, then he's a dead man walking. So he'll have to escalate, and that's what they're apparently doing. When you escalate like that, the chances of miscalculation increase exponentially. Now, I try to be an objective analyst here, targeting government buildings, police headquarters, and those are legitimate military targets. Unfortunately, targeting television transmitters is a legitimate military target. You're trying to knock down their propaganda systems, that would be their words for it. But
the residential tower blocks are not.
And right, yeah, exactly. So some of these munitions that they're using don't appear to be of the smart kind. Now, a cruise missile is, because an operator is guiding it using a camera in the nose cone of the cruise missile. But some of these, are dumb bombs. And certainly, if you start using hyperbaric weapons and cluster munitions, then your intent is to terrorize the population into submission. And I think that's what's going on. they've decided now to go from a limited territorial war with, again, the purpose to overthrow the government in Kiev, to now a terroristic war. There's a formal term for that, which is state terrorism in wartime. The bombing of Dresden is a classic example of that. It didn't have a military purpose, but it shocked and awed the people of Dresden and Germany in general.
And retaliation for Coventry too, wasn't it?
Exactly. So I think we're seeing the beginning of this. He's trying to undermine the will of the Ukrainian people. I think the reverse is going to happen. It's going to stiffen their resolve to fight, and they're doing things. The psychological warfare here is really quite fascinating, because the Russians have been beaming out images of Chechnyan mercenaries coming in and slaughtering people. The Chechens are known for their brutality, for raping, torturing before murdering civilians. And the Russians have been putting this out on their propaganda airwaves, aimed at the Ukraine to intimidate the population. The Chechens are coming to get you. And I don't think that's going to work either. I think that the Ukrainians are a very different kettle of fish than, I hate to say it, many Western Europeans. And they're going to fight, particularly if they're able to be resupplied across their land borders to NATO countries. Romania and Poland are two of them. So, this could bog down, and then we risk two things. We risk escalation into major war, a genocidal war, and or an overthrow of Putin by his commanders. Now, with regards to that convoy, just to end, that's fascinating, because they look like sitting ducks. Now, you're absolutely right. It's very clear that the Russians have decimated the Ukrainian air bases. The Ukrainians can't get out and fly unimpeded. But that doesn't mean they couldn't use drones, which can be launched, from courtyards. They have a fleet of those Turkish drones that proved so effective in the war between Albania and Azerbaijan. Those have not been used yet. But then, as you said, all you have to do is put IEDs in the front and back of that convoy, and then you can slowly pick them off using conventional ground forces, because they have no room to maneuver. They really can't go anywhere. Of course, if they're tracked vehicles, they can get off the road and move into the fields and whatnot, but that still allows them to be attacked by both irregular and regular conventional forces. So there's some questions that maybe the Russians are stymied by Western cyber intercepts, electronic disruptions. They can't communicate. Their command and control systems cannot talk to each other. Remember, everything is computerized in these modern battlefields. And if you can hack in to computer systems and disrupt them, they literally cannot talk from the head of that column to the back of the column.
That's interesting. So if we,
that's what's going on. Is there? We talked about the electromagnetic wave. I think they may be feeling the effects of something that's coming out of the West.
Yeah, I think so. We haven't talked off air on this, and I've come to a position on this myself. If you go back, say, 18 months, 2 years ago, Paul, I identified, my business part of it is open source intelligence and pulling information out. Basically, it will interpret that into an English language. So in this case, like pulling out of the Russian military, it encrypts that into English, and you can see what they are actually pushing to their own language speaking people. Out it goes. Now, governments have that kind of stuff all the time, but it goes to clients in this respect. One of the things I remember flagging up with you was the Russian military was claiming that it made a big breakthrough, that it was not just able to scramble the communications of an opponent in a theatre of conflict, but it was able to unencrypt place in communications of which it wanted, so basically false or disinformation, and in real time have that communication received by the opponent in the theatre of conflict, believing that it was communications between each other. Now, it seems to me that that was a significant breakthrough in communication types, hybrid warfare, if you like. The West, I don't believe, would have sat on its laurels knowing that the Russians were crowing in an open source environment about such things. And I think that we've been seeing the evidence of this type of response from the West that has completely knocked the Russian logistics communication planning off its stride. So I just wanted to add that into the mix, and you may have a view on that.
Yeah, let me, you're anticipating something I was going to talk about a little later in the show, but I might as well do it now.
Yeah.
Let's think of it this way. Let's build the case. 3 of the Five Eyes partners are NATO members. Five Eyes has formidable offensive and defensive capabilities. It is possible that NATO has asked the Five Eyes to help them with disrupting Russian communications. And they would do so by supplying the Ukrainians with the type of sophisticated technologies needed to blanket the theater with what I'll call, for the sake of argument, chaff. Just put a blizzard of chaff out there. Now, they do it in far more sophisticated ways. This is not like, just a gray screen on a TV. But what's interesting to me is that we know that in Iraq and in Afghanistan, the Five Eyes had tactical as well as strategic responsibilities. So let's say in this instance, strategic would be to listen to the communications between Moscow and the battlefields, and if possible to disrupt them, or if necessary to disrupt them, but mostly to listen in. Tactically, though, you need officers on the ground. That is, you need Five Eyes operatives on the ground to help their Ukrainian counterparts with these very sophisticated technologies that the Ukrainians have not had access to. Now, if you put NATO Five Eyes people on the ground in the Ukraine, that might provoke the Russians. So what is left to put into the ground? Well, the 2 non-NATO partners of the Five Eyes, which are Australia and New Zealand.
That's an interesting scenario.
Yeah. And we know that Australians and New Zealand signals intelligence officers were used in Afghanistan and used in Iraq, particularly in the battle for Mosul. We had, I say we, New Zealanders, we had our people on the ground assisting the coalition to identify targets, to disrupt Daesh's communications, all the sort of stuff that they could well be doing in the Ukraine right now. And the Russians really can't do anything about Australians and New Zealanders because we're NATO partners, but we're not NATO members. So we can offer our assistance willy-nilly. That would annoy them, to be sure. There might be diplomatic repercussions. But I have a feeling that Five Eyes is integrally involved on the side of the Ukrainians. And this may have something to do with the repeated imagery of Soviet armor and troop formations being stuck on the ground, because I think they simply cannot communicate with each other. And I'll give you an illustration. You may have seen this. There's a very interesting video filmed by a Ukrainian guy who's driving down a highway northeast of Kiev, and he comes upon a Russian armored column. And he drives up to the first one, and they're parked, and the soldiers are outside smoking.
Yep.
And he says to them, "What are you doing?" And they go, "We ran out of gas."
Yeah.
And he goes, "Ran out of gas. Can I give you a lift back to Moscow?" And so they all laugh. They're all talking in Russian. But then he says, "Where are you going?" And they say, "Well, we don't know. We think Kiev." And that's when I thought to myself, all right, this is what happens. You send the columns out, in the general direction of the target. But it's only when you get within 20 miles of the target, then you open your channels of communication and you tell the commanders you're headed to, and you name an army base, you name an airfield, someplace specific. They were out on a road out in the middle of nowhere. So they were still chugging along to someplace unspecified when their communications got jammed. And so they really don't know where they have to, the general area of Kiev. And that's when I started thinking about Five Eyes. I think, who has the capability to take down communications on that scale? Because that armored column appeared to have about 10 vehicles in it. And, a mixture of tanks. They had no tankers, obviously enough. They had no fuel. And so, and that's, we'll leave aside discussions we've had in the past about putting your fuel up front. I think what the Russians miscalculated was that they felt they would be relatively well received in the Russian-speaking areas of eastern Ukraine, and that they would be able to get their fuel, from the population. And it turns out many in the Russian-speaking areas don't like Russians. They don't. Them there.
The bombing on Kharkiv, for example, on the very eastern side, and that city it seems like overnight has fallen to Russian control. But it has been a fight that the Russians did not expect. If we looked at, let's have a look. Let's bring up the maps that we looked at some time ago. This was about 2 episodes ago. And we see that on screen now, and we can see the manoeuvres that was a possible, back in the end of January, a possible kind of scenario of what the Russians were planning. And in many cases, this is what the Russians attempted to, coming across from the eastern border of Ukraine, across to the Dnipro River, for example, coming from the northeast down toward Kiev, also coming down on the western side of Chernobyl and in there with Belarusian troops if they so needed them. And also we see the map showing lines coming to the south, moving across up from the Crimea to secure those ports. Now, overnight, we understand that the Russians have taken control of those southern ports of Ukraine and are within striking distance, perhaps, of making a move on Odessa, the significant city of the south there, from the point of view of tactical manoeuvres, I would suggest. If we look at that map, though, we can see where the stalling in the east of Russian advance. We can certainly see that it has not been able to get through the defensive curtain, if you like, of the Ukrainian defences around Kiev from the north or the northeast. And so we are, while, like you pointed out, a comparison to the American invasion of Iraq and Baghdad, the Russians were believing, as you've identified here and underscored, that eastern side was something that basically be a walkover. I'll just go back to picking up the point of the politics here, Paul. For example, yesterday we saw a lot more attention given to Ukraine's call to the European Union for it to have its membership to the European Union bloc fast-tracked. We also saw, and I'll bring it up on screen here, we saw reportage coming out from the European countries, and this is via Deutsche Welle in Germany, about how Turkey, of which is one of the countries of that, we didn't call it a nexus because that's too formal and too that's wouldn't have been a reality of countries that would align with support for Russia and Putin's Russia, I should say, in this type of a manoeuvre. But we believed that there was an argument that the authoritarian positions that Turkey had taken under its current leadership suggested that it may join some sort of Russian-led bipolar type of arrangement in the world. The Turkish have obviously come back with that kind of suggestion, because obviously we weren't exclusive in believing the Turkish government would move in such a way. And it is announced that it is invoking the Montreux convention, which basically means it has the right, Turkey has the right to filter and to stop under certain conditions the transiting of military vessels through the narrows and through the narrow gaps, if you like, that go from the Mediterranean, the Adriatic, and up into the Black Sea. So that is a significant geopolitical move that in the past has made Turkey such a valuable and coveted position in any kind of war. Paul, there's also, I'm just skipping through these things, the Ukraine contact here and the Ukraine conflict, if you like. India trying to hold ties with both the West under Modi and also hold and test its relationship with the Russian Federation at this juncture this week with the Putin-led government. So what we're talking about here is that it appears that you've got India abstaining from the point of view of a vote at the United Nations General Assembly. You've also got it wanting to hold on to its trade of Russian weapons it seems to use in its border skirmishes with the Chinese. Meanwhile, you've got China, who is one of those other countries that Putin would have relied on, basically coming to a situation where the West is picking up on Western strategic analysis, in this case the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, saying basically that Beijing knows very well, and it's watching very closely what happens to Putin. It does not want sanctions on itself. It doesn't want any mission creep that pulls it into this conflict in any way closer than what it already has. So its abstentions at the Security Council at the United Nations and in the General Assembly is about as far as it's going. That's hardly an endorsement for what Putin is attempting to do to Ukraine, is it?
Oh yeah, I'll start with Turkey just as a historical clarification, and then go into things like sanctions. The Montreux Agreement is interesting because it specifies that warships are allowed to pass through the Bosphorus Straits if they're returning to their home ports. So Russian ships in the Mediterranean can return through the Bosphorus Straits if their home ports are in Sevastopol, Odessa, or further to the east. In Russia itself. However, the Turks do have the right to impede any warship that does not have a home port as its final destination. And, and that could involve U.S. warships and whatever. I guess the question is, Selwyn, it's been interesting that the Turks try to remain neutral, although they condemn the invasion. But what are they going to do about it if the Russians decide that they are going to transfer assets from the Pacific and Indian Ocean and Mediterranean into the Black Sea as this war drags on?
This is where it's interesting, because just to remember that Turkey is a member of it's a NATO country.
Yes.
So, that could be the Achilles heel of the Russian Federation should it try to force its vessels through. And, in a way, it's safe passage if those military vessels are designated as having their home port up in the Black Sea area where they can get through. But if they leave port, that is seen in contravention of that convention, the Montreux Convention. Yes. And it can be subject to military manoeuvres by way of NATO and forced through Turkey to actually do something about that. And the Russians have got superiority at the moment in the Black Sea. I don't think they want something coming from the south. It's an interesting photograph that we've got up there. You can see the Sultan's Palace in Istanbul and behind there. I've been there myself. If you're standing by the Sultan's Palace looking across this narrow stretch of water, it is narrow. People, it is very narrow. And this is why Turkey is such a strategic country in this respect. But Paul, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? If we look at what the Swiss have done, you were wanting to pick up on the China issue before we skip on.
Yeah, I'll make it quick. So that brings up the issue of third parties. And that in turn brings up the issue of the sanctions regime. You remember last week we talked about, for sanctions to work, they have to have breadth and they have to have depth. So they have to encompass a whole array of Russian interests, and they have to go from the systemic through the institutional to the individual level. Well, there's more to it than that. They have to be effective through first party, second party, and third parties. Those sanctions regime have to be adhered to by third parties. Well, who are third parties? There are any number of countries that are not principals in the conflict, but who may have business interests with the Russians and what have you. India is interesting because they want to keep the weapons flow from Russia, which means that would violate the sanctions regime. But then they have a political objective, which is they've abstained. That's what the Indians have done, as the Chinese have done. They have territorial ambitions of their own with restive areas and provinces. And so by abstaining, they're guaranteeing themselves, they think, a Russian abstention in the event, for example, that India decides to purge Kashmir of its Muslim population, which the ultra-nationalist Modi is doing by stealth even as we speak. Same with the Chinese. They have ambitions that include the eventual complete annexation of Bhutan and Nepal. And certainly this way they can buy some Russian compliance in the event they do that, but they want to watch how the world reacts to the Ukrainian invasion, which is a much bigger thing, a much bigger enterprise than going after Kashmir or Nepal and Bhutan. So there's both commercial, and of course then, as we've talked about at some length, the Chinese and Russians have a strategic partnership involving energy exports and what have you.
Yeah. And
now,
Belt and Road issues.
A multitude. Now, it brings up this business of the removing Russia from the international banking code known as SWIFT.
Yeah.
The SWIFT system is how you get money from one country to another. That's going to be a significant measure because even if the Chinese want to continue to trade with the Russians, they have no place to pay. The Russians are cut off completely. And so you may want to pay the Russians.
On that point, there may be some listeners that are thinking, yes, but the Chinese have developed their own foreign transfer system, the SIPs, or the control of financial transfers, cross-border financial transfers is basically what SIPs stands for there. But at the same time, while that exists, and yes, renminbi, the foreign exchange currency of the People's Republic of China, can be used as the basis of that as opposed to the United States dollar, it still needs SWIFT to enact it. And that's information of which has fallen out of some of the analysis early yesterday evening New Zealand time, but is firmed up as a reality and a fact over New Zealand period of our morning timeline. So that's an interesting thing. If you lay this on top of, for example, if we get back to the pressures on Putin, he is not able to break through on the foreign exchange elements of this constriction that the world states that dominate, for example, the multilateral bodies have all seem to have agreed on with respect to SWIFT. But the Swiss coming out also with respect to hurting the oligarchs with the sanctions on their wealth that is in Swiss control. Now, that is significant in the sense it took 2 years post 9/11 for the United States to impress upon Switzerland to actually open up its transactions relating to the financial trading of Al-Qaeda at that time. It took around 2 years. This has taken a matter of days, and the Swiss have complied, opened up, and says, we are putting sanctions on oligarch money. Now, that must be getting a lot of attention by the oligarchs. If it can be successfully argued, I'd suggest, Paul, that Putin enjoys the privilege of leadership inside Russia by two different groups. One is that the support of the oligarchs, and secondly, the military generals. Do you believe that with the response from NATO, with the high risk of a misstep militarily, and also with the constraints that are occurring globally on oligarch assets, do you think Putin's leadership is under stress?
Yes, I do. I think that he's backed himself into a corner. Let me point out that even with the SWIFT system, excluding Russia, you need it's about those third-party enforcement of sanctions. You're going to need to freeze Russian assets in third parties. That is, if they've moved a lot of their assets to, let's say, a New Zealand bank or a Brazilian bank, they have to be frozen there. And if you can freeze their offshore assets at the same time that you cut Russia off at all levels, Russian banks, Russian finances at all levels, then the pain goes around. The pain is felt by the Russian public. The pain is felt by the oligarchs. And you're absolutely right. And it's amazing. But once again, we have confirmation of what scholars have written about for eons, which is at the end of the day, dictators, no matter if they're institutionalized or not, ultimately rest on two legs. One are the elites of the moment, and the other is the repressive apparatus. And Putin has now found himself in exactly that situation. And that could well be his undoing, because by hurting the oligarchs, I mean, I had said to you last week, I'm not as much interested about the oligarchs not being able to, get their money, get their hands on their money. But if it undermines the faith of the oligarchs in Putin's stewardship of the nation, then he's in serious trouble. And that appears to be the objective of this sanction regime. It's to put a pain onto the Russian public, but he has the repressive apparatus to quell them. But you put the pain on the oligarchs, and they have the power to remove him. And it'll be bloody, but they can do it. Now, the military side is interesting. As you well know, I spent a lot of time on military channels and strategy groups and things of that sort. There is a growing belief in some strategic quarters that the leadership of the Russian military is incompetent. That what Putin has done is he's taken merit out of the promotion cycle and put personal loyalty into it instead, and that the loyalists that he has running his military are not competent military commanders, and they're making mistakes that are costing Russian lives. You can only cover that with your propaganda and disinformation for a while. But if those losses start becoming, in the tens of thousands, and that would happen if this war drags on for any length of time, then the military leadership, not at the general level, not so much at the flag level, but at the field level, so colonels, guys who are now in the Ukraine, once they realize that their orders are inept, that they're being ordered to either kill civilians, that may not worry them that much, but on the other hand, is going to get themselves killed, they may start to rebel. And I've always thought it was interesting, a war between the Ukraine and Russia, and let's say Russians on the Ukrainians, is akin to a war between the United States and Canada. I mean, many Ukrainians are ethnic Russians, speak Russian, just like many Canadians speak English, but there's a minority. In the case of Canada, the Quebecois, who speak French. In the case of Ukraine, native Ukrainians who speak Ukrainian, but the countries are intermeshed. So fighting a war with such a country must be difficult from the Russian side. I mean, you must be absolutely convinced in Putin's justifications to go after Ukrainians. And you know what? I don't think they are. I think he's got problems in his command and control structure.
And
And
certainly
so
in his advisory areas, yeah? I mean, if we look at that there's so many differences between the Soviet Union period and the Russian Federation period led by Putin, so many differences. But one of those differences is if you had, for example, the commander-in-chief, the leader of the Soviet Union sitting there, he has the Politburo to answer to. And obviously the exchanges between the Politburo and its chosen representative at any particular given time is extremely robust. If we just go to this photo with Putin sitting there addressing his advisors, there's a big distance there. It gives every suggestion. What it brings to mind to me, Paul, is something that you raised last year in one of our episodes, where the bigger the lapel of a dictator becomes, the more at risk they are of falling. And it seems that this distance, this whole emphasis, this communication that Putin is using to make it look like he's the supreme leader may fall into the big lapel theory. But it's an interesting kind of thing in juxtapositioning that what it does illustrate, I think, and what you were talking about there is Putin is surrounded, if there is any advice, by people that perhaps do not have what's required to advise frankly and freely in such a most serious type of conflict.
Yeah, I mean, look at there. That picture tells a lot. Now, my understanding is that Western intelligence believes that Putin had a bad case of COVID sometime in the last 18 months, and it went very badly for him. And how he's paranoid about COVID. So the argument is, look, don't read too much into those distance shots because he's just paranoid about getting COVID from the rest of that crowd. However, that may be half of the story. He's increasingly isolated within his own command structure because no one wants to cross him. No one wants, it's just what you said. No, he's surrounded by yes men. They're telling him what he wants to know. Do you think anyone wants to go and say, hey, our official figures for dead in this war so far is 437. It's actually closer to 4,300. No one wants to tell him that. And that's the problem with dictators is that their feedback loops start becoming opaque. You know, again, no one wants to be sincere and tell the big guy that things are not going well. So I don't want to cheerlead the way, for example, you see CNN, they're saying, oh, the resistance is great. This thing is bogged down. He's losing his mind. He's increasingly erratic. I don't believe any of that. I think the resistance has been remarkable, but the Russians can still win within a week or two. And then all of his objectives can be achieved.
Except for sustaining it, like we said two episodes ago. The problem of sustaining the effort does not. This is where the question was rose by us ourselves, didn't it? If he does go across the line of the river and he does take Kiev, how does he sustain that? He can't.
Right.
So it's a pointless exercise, and yet he's done this.
Well, I mean, again, the longer this drags out, the worse it is for him. The irony here is that he wanted to fracture NATO and Finlandize all of Eastern Europe. What he's done is reunite NATO around its original purpose, which then was to back off the Soviet Union. Now they are completely united in not only opposition to Russian aggression, but a repudiation of Russia as a revanchist superpower, and him certainly threatening a raising of the nuclear, alert levels. I mean, that's a bluff. There's no one threatening him with nuclear weapons. That's a sign of weakness. And I could tell you a little bit, if you're interested, a little bit about the Russian command and control structure over nuclear weapons, which is different than that of the United States, and which has more veto power given to the military commanders than in the United States.
Okay.
So in the United States, the president has the codes. The codes go directly to the missile silos. Once he puts those codes on, the guys in the missile silos, they push buttons and they kill lots of people. In Russia, that does not happen. He gives the order to the military command. The military command then can either directly issue the codes to the missile commanders, or they can allow the missile commanders some degree of discretion, depending on their targeting packages. But there is a veto power by the Russian military on the Russian president that does not exist in the United States unless you take the codes away from the president. And again, we've talked about the fact that that very likely happened with Trump, as it did with Reagan. He was just too irrational to allow him to have the real codes. Now, but that's a sign of weakness. And so what you're looking at now is whether he quits now or whether he wins or whether he's bogged down for 4 months. NATO is stronger in its unity of purpose than it has been since the end of the Cold War. This is not turning out good for him. He's not going to fracture NATO. He's not going to Finlandize Latvia and Estonia. And that's where you think, okay, what's your end game now? If you're escalating, you're going to bring the Belarusians into this fight. Are you going to attack Poland, a NATO member?
And then it's basically all over then. And that's regional warfare that has spiraled out of control from the point of view of Russia's interests. He can't win that. So what we've brought up on screen for those that are listening and not seeing is a map that came once again making reference to the CSIS, or the Centre for Strategic International Studies. And what they're showing is a map here that looks at what possibly could take place should Russia take Kiev, establish its controls over the centre of the country right across to the east, and then advance across to the western border of Ukraine, which laps on Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, NATO nations. Perhaps the most resistant to this is Poland. Any excursion over those borders or any pressure on those borders with Poland, one would imagine the Polish will retaliate with the full force and backing of NATO. It does not appear a map that Putin, in a sane situation, would contemplate trying to risk, nor does it sit and serve his strategic interest of requiring a buffer. If he takes Ukraine right to the western border, he's got no buffer. The buffer zone is gone.
And the thing is, why would he do it, since he said all along that he wants a buffer in the form of the Ukraine? But more importantly, he's telling his military commanders that this is all about creating a buffer to secure Mother Russia from the hostilities of NATO members. So why would you run up to the borders of NATO members? I mean, that's a highly provocative move. And his military commanders were sold a bill of goods. They were sold, you're just creating a buffer. Now they're sitting looking across at really angry Polish people. The only part of that western flank that may be the Achilles heel of NATO is Hungary, because it's run by a right-wing authoritarian in the person of Viktor Orban. But the Romanians will fight. The Poles certainly will fight. So he's on a hiding to nothing if he crosses the river and makes the move. Plus, he's going to bog down because the Ukrainians, they're not stupid. They have moved a lot of their assets to the west precisely to be able to stage from there. Putin has committed now 2 echelons of his invasion force. He has a third one left. And let's be clear how brutal this is. His first echelon was full of conscripts. Those are the image of the crying teenage boys who, upon capture, call for their mothers. And the Ukrainians are very smart in the psychological operations department, because they give these kids phones and say, call your mom and tell her that you're alive. Yeah. And so now the Russians are getting straight from the mouths of these babes the bad news that things aren't going well.
And one of them claimed that the Russian officers were killing the wounded Russian soldiers because they didn't want to have to nurse them back, and there was no logistics and med care available to them in any case. So the fear of their own people, it raised to mind, what was happening when the siege of Stalingrad was occurring. Basically any Russian that stopped was basically capped and off at the point, and others, if they fell, pick up the gun of the other. So it's
I mean, obviously,
look, we're talking propaganda wars here. I get that, but it's about the communication, the symbolism, and I'm underscoring the significance of that move that the Ukrainian forces are doing, of giving them the phone, saying, "Ring your mother, have a chat, and we're going to film you."
No, I mean it's brilliant. It's a brilliant strategy. The Ukrainians will treat Russian prisoners of war with decency. They'll honor the Geneva Convention. They're not savages. Some of those Russians, you wonder, and certainly the Chechens, are barbarians. But right now, he's committed about 2/3 of his 150,000 plus troops. The second echelon involved paratroopers. It's involving directed naval fire. So he's upping the ante quite a bit. Again, a lot of this are unguided munitions. It's not smart bombs. His third echelon are his special forces. And usually you hold them so that they can go in after all the big fighting and go and find the Ukrainian leadership and do them in. Get into, if you will, the rat warrens underneath certain buildings and go after them that way. I think he's going to have to commit his third echelon earlier, before the very specific tasks that they would have been assigned are achievable. And that's when the whole western side of Ukraine comes in, because right now we focus on the refugee outflows. 850,000 people have flowed out of the Ukraine. No one's talking about the weapons inflows. And again, signals intelligence types. I mean, if you're not a NATO member, but you are a signals intelligence guy from some other place, you can go into the Ukraine. No one's going to stop you from looking for a fight. There's a lot of back and forth. That's a two-way street on those borders. And the Russians, the closer they get to the river, the harder it's going to be for them to cross it, simply because of the weight of the opposition now being arrayed against them on the west side of the Dnieper. So, I mean, I think that Putin has a window of about a month where he can achieve his objectives and get a negotiated solution that might involve Ukraine not joining NATO for the foreseeable future. If he commits atrocities on a grand scale, or if he doesn't get this over with within a month or so, then he's been defeated. Again, the West is united. That sanctions regime is really going to start to bite if it's enforceable. And you made the good point. Even the Chinese got to think twice now that the SWIFT code to Russia has been broken or has been eliminated. Everybody's got to pause and realize the material repercussions that are coming their way if they continue to support the Russians one way or another. And at that point, self-interest comes in. I mean, if Putin's war is costing Chinese businesses profits, then he becomes expendable. And again, the oligarchs are a whole separate equation, but it's his war. It's his baby. If he didn't inform his military commanders about the full extent of his ambitions, which some people are claiming, that even his military commanders thought he was just going into the separatist regions and were caught by surprise when he told them to press the offensive further west. If all of this is true, and again, it is speculation, then he better get this over with pretty quickly, and he better get it over with on his terms, because if not, he's a dead man walking. And quite frankly, I'm starting to think that he just may be, because the Ukrainians are going nowhere. They may be slaughtered in droves. Their cities may wind up being devastated. I mean, it's not rational. That's why for the past few weeks, I've been saying he's not going to do that, because he just wants a buffer. But he's backed into a corner, and now he's ordering this escalation into a terror campaign. I don't know. At one point, NATO members may surreptitiously start putting in their own version of the little green men, people not wearing uniforms, but who know how to fight. I don't know when that starts, and if it should start, because that raises, a very darker prospect. But certainly, time is not on Putin's side, and everybody except his inner circle appear to know that.
On that point, let's conclude the program. Thank you for your company, Paul, and your contribution. It's exceptional. Thank you very much. And also, thank you to the people that have watched the live recording of this podcast, and also to those that are listening to it once it's on demand. Until this time next week, take care out there, and we look forward to bringing our program back to you again at Thursday around mid-time New Zealand time, which is in the evening United States Eastern time. Thank you very much. Goodbye.